heritage. I'm Anna Summers-Cox of the art newspaper and our sister paper, Il Giornale Dell'Arte. So we're having some Italian people following us as well. And we are incredibly pleased and honored to be working with the Factum Foundation on this project, which we think is extraordinarily interesting and visionary. Thank you also to the very distinguished speakers and chair for this session and those that are going to come next. I've placed myself deliberately in front of my Velázquez. My Velázquez was painted by my grandmother in 1899 in June. She is in the book of the copyists in the Prado, and she did more than one of these very large and really very good copies. But we're not talking about copies here. Good as it is just an approximation. What Factum can do is they can do something which is an exact replica, exact in all its information as well as its appearance. And that is the essential difference. And the possibilities that this opens up in terms of documentation and in replication are simply huge. The thing that first caught my attention was the great painting by Veronese of the Marriage at Cana that you see in the Louvre with great difficulty because it's in the same room as the Mona Lisa. So you have to share the room with this great crowd of people all photographing at one end, and the other picture is semi-ignored. Now, what Factum did is they produced a wonderful replica, and so it is back in the place for which it was painted, lit through the same windows by which it was lit in the 16th century, and the room is effectively empty. So the discussion could be, which of the two is better? Well, the answer is neither. They're complementary. It's just an example of how this capacity to produce facsimiles can enrich and improve our understanding of works of art, which so often are now in orphanages, museums, orphanages of works of art that have lost their homes. I don't want to say any more because Adam is here. Adam is the person who created first Factum Art, now it's called the Factum Foundation. So Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be kicking off this series of events. But it's amazing to see Anna sitting in front of a beautiful copy of a Velázquez painting. Velázquez was born in 1599, and that year could very easily be remembered as one of the great plague years in the history of the city of Seville. So we're very, very happy that events like the one we're living through pass. And it's with great joy that we remember 1599 much more commonly as Velázquez's birth year than as a year of plague in Seville. And one of the things that's really been in my mind recently and over the past few weeks is actually how ideas travel and how they can travel over distance. I mean, thinking about Velázquez, one has to imagine in a way how Caravaggio's paintings that were painted while Velázquez was still very young could have reached the creative circle in Seville and could have influenced the way that Velázquez worked, the way he painted ordinary people, the way he painted from life, the way he picked up figures coming out of dark backgrounds, the way, I mean, in a way his lightness of touch and his extraordinary virtuosity as a realist painter allowed him to sort of create a kind of diplomatic elegance that is evidence in the picture behind Anna. Basically, art is a representation that allows us to see through other people's eyes. And one of the subtexts we want to touch on in these discussions today, tomorrow, and on Sunday is really the relationship between art and its social role, to separate the importance, if you like, of creative culture from tourism, leisure, and sport. The series basically is only possible to happen through the generosity of all of the people who are going to be participating. So the first session, which is going to be chaired by Charles Somers-Smith, is focused on museums, objects, display, online, offline access, the power of originality, authenticity, copies, facsimiles. And in a way, the sort of background question is, has the muse left the museum? Will she find a new habitat in a virtual world, or actually are these two worlds really just different aspects of representation? The second session is focused on the circulation of objects, on sharing and a new approach to ownership that prioritizes preservation and dissemination, a system that celebrates the biographies of objects and their diverse character. And the third session focuses on technology, its impact on creating, recording, providing access, archiving, interpreting, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and really the growth of a new generation of digital connoisseurs. So the debates were really triggered by the shutdown of a series of exhibitions because of COVID-19, particularly two that were scheduled for Palazzo Fava in Bologna. One, the return of a masterpiece, the Politico Grafoni, Reborn in Bologna, and the second, the materiality of the aura, new technologies for preservation. They were both accompanied by a book, a compilation of essays, The Aura in the Age of Digital Materiality, Rethinking Preservation in the Shadow of an Uncertain Future. And this book can be downloaded for free from Factum's website. Basically, coronavirus has thrown the world into a bit of a spin, and serious economists like George Soros are proposing perpetual bonds, amongst other ways of rethinking value and rebooting the economy. It's time perhaps to press reset. Art has become sucked into an economic system that's emerged, focused around art fairs and auction houses, free ports and record prices. But really, what we want to do now is to look at the whole scenario that we're living within and working within, and ask, can technology help us reconnect? Can it facilitate a new kind of discourse that can reach every corner of the planet? And can we all work together to ensure we don't just go back to exactly as the way things were before? So I'm going to hand over now to Charles, and he's going to introduce all of the speakers on the first of the three panels. The second is tomorrow night at the same time, and the third on Sunday night at the same time. We're obviously looking forward to a very lively conversation. Questions can be asked on YouTube, so on the comments box on the YouTube channel, or on Factum's social media, which is factumsocialmedia@gmail.com. So Charles, over to you, and I look forward to what happens next.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly explain the format. Each of the five speakers is going to say a short introduction of their thoughts. Then we'll have a bit of general discussion. And then, as Adam has just said, people will send in questions and we'll have discussion around the questions. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce the speakers. Marina Abramovic is writer, novelist, critic, and historian, professor of English and creative writing at Birkbeck College. Currently, she's president of the Royal Society of Literature, fellow of the British Academy. She won the Holberg Prize for her work on myths. Mark Jones worked for a long time at the British Museum in the Department of Coins and Medals. He did a very well-remembered exhibition, well remembered by me, 1988 on fakes. Then he was director of the National Museums of Scotland, the Victoria and Albert Museum. When he was Master of St. Cross College, Oxford, he's now chairman of the National Trust for Scotland. Mary Lending is Professor of Architectural History and Theory at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. She wrote a wonderful book called Plaster Monuments, Architecture and the Power of Reproduction, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2017. And she's a contributor to the book which Adam mentioned, which has just been published, called The Aura in the Age of Digital Materiality. Andres Santo is a consultant in the field of cultural policy, and he's a wide-ranging author on museum and cultural policy more generally. I particularly recommend a recent article he wrote, which was published a week ago on ArtNet, which tells museums what they can and should be doing in terms of opening up again, which I thought was admirably clear and straightforward. Neil MacGregor was the director of the National Gallery from 1987 to 2002, director of the British Museum from 2002 to 2012. He was the founding director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, which, Neil, is it still going to open in September or has it been postponed?
We don't know when it's going to open, probably next year,
Okay, so over to Marina to start us off.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk on this. I think it's very easy to be a snob about reproductions. And I think I was brought up in that tradition, that somehow we were worshipping the real thing, we were in quest of the real thing, and the real thing was not in any way a facsimile or a copy or even a cast, which would be exactly reproduce the original. But I think that this is mistaken, and I came to realizing that I wanted to modify this considerably by looking at what people held sacred. And I found that while there was a strong emphasis on the real relic in Catholicism, or the icon that actually was the portrait of the Virgin Mary by St. Luke, made at the time, that actually a history of replication and reproduction permeates the whole of the quest of the sacred, and that actually Europe is full of copies of the Temple of Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, and much later things like the grottos of Lourdes. And people created the sacred by imitation and replication in many, many ways. So it seemed to me that the aura of a sacred object, of a valued thing, the aura of a painting or work of art, was not inherently in its authenticity, in its singularity. It actually was created and fabricated in many different ways. And I just very quickly want to point to two principal ones. One is the story. And museums are places where stories accrue to works of art. Now, the contact value with the subject, or with now increasingly the artist, increases the aura. But that contact does not necessarily have to be exact or materially embedded in the material of the object. Secondly, and this is very, very strong in the history of auratic works, what Alfred Gell, the anthropologist, called the technology of enchantment. The more virtuosic a piece is, the more it can be demonstrated to be virtuosic, the more complex and inaccessible it is to other people doing it, the more auratic it will become. And so actually, I think this digital age is capable of producing these very auratic objects. And in fact, Factum Arte's magical replications of works of art seems to me to fit within this history.
Okay, Mark Jones, second.
Well, I was thinking back to when I was a young curator in the British Museum, and I found myself walking behind a slightly older American couple. He was saying to his wife in confidential tones, you know, none of this is real. They're all copies. They keep the real stuff in the basement. Just about 100 years before that, George Wallace, who was keeper of the art collections at the what was to be the V&A, gave a paper called The Formation of Art Museums for the People. And he argued that it was better to exhibit reproductions rather than originals in museums, because, as he put it, the vulgar, degrading, and factitious admiration of an object because it's cost a huge sum of money would be got rid of. And the aesthetic qualities of art as representative of nature and the genius of bygone ages would have a chance of being recognized and appreciated. And so what I wanted to ask is, why didn't this idea take off? It was a logical, sensible, economical idea. It built on the example of the cast courts, which acted as a great encyclopedia of European sculpture and architecture. But the idea fell flat. And why was that? So people think now that it was a matter of technology. Copies were imperfect then and are now indistinguishable from the real thing. But that really isn't true. It's only a few months ago that I was in Glasgow talking to the very experienced curator there, about whether a medal of James VI was the real thing or an electrotype copy. And neither of us could make up our minds, because actually electrotypes are indistinguishable from the real thing. And of course, you know, never a year goes by without us discovering that what was previously thought to be a copy is in fact an original, or that what was previously thought to be an original is in fact a copy. So the production of copies indistinguishable from originals is not a new phenomenon. Actually, it wasn't the absence of the technology needed to make accurate copies that was the problem, but its success. It was the ready availability of brilliant reproductions that undermined their prestige. But there was something else too. Until the third quarter of the 19th century, copies were highly prestigious. The Duke of Bedford had his London house designed so that it could display Thornhill's copies of the Raphael cartoons. The Duke of Northumberland commissioned Anton Raphael Mengs to make copies of Raphael, and Raphael's and Mengs's copy of Raphael's School of Athens was much admired in its own right as a brilliant copy. So what happened in the 19th century? Certainly by the 20th century, copies were despised, even loathed, in extraordinary acts of vandalism. 19th century plaster casts were smashed by art schools. The V&A didn't just dispose of, but destroyed Richard Evans's copies of Raphael's decorative schemes for the Vatican Loggie. And even now, though the value of copies in providing evidence for work that's been lost or defaced or degraded is increasingly recognized, and I think nobody who's experienced the V&A cast courts could seriously argue that they lack aura, the value of copies, experiential as well as evidential, is underestimated. And the great Bruciani molds from which the plaster casts of the 19th century were made still lie neglected and at risk in a museum store. I think the reason for this lies in the first Impressionist exhibition. European art until that moment had been based on copying the masters of the past. Genius announced itself, as in Michelangelo's case and many others, by the ability to produce deceptive copies. Genius from the first Impressionist exhibition onwards lay not in learning from the past, but in translating a subjective impression onto canvas. Max Friedlander, an admirer of Impressionism, wrote in On Art and Connoisseurship, "A perfect copy is almost a contradiction in terms. A copy lacks everything a true work of art must possess. It lacks directness and spontaneity. An original," he wrote, "resembles an organism. A copy, a machine." And so in the 20th century, it came to be taken for granted that the value of a work of art lay in its originality. Even Chinese art was, and by some still is, despised because each generation had learned from the past. They show no originality, was the ignorant cry. Copies are wonderful. They can help us to understand and enjoy the art of the past, free from the constraints imposed by conservation and security. We can never see the paintings in Lascaux, but we can or could enjoy and marvel at a perfect replica. But when value in art is identified with the expression of the subjective, with the experience of the individual, copies suffer. Now, thankfully, fashion in art is changing again. Skill is admired once more, and the past is mined for ideas. The glorification of self-expression above all may be on its way out. Time, perhaps, to realize George Wallace's great idea.
Very good, thank you, Mary. Next, from Oslo.
Monuments have an uncanny ability to seek us out, even when we're stuck at home. Corona reminds us that throughout the 19th century, replicas were constantly presented as substitutes for travel, even from the core of elitist grand tour culture. John Soane, for instance, used the exquisite plaster cast in his home museum for his students at the Royal Academy to give those, I'm quoting, who could not visit Greece and Italy some better ideas of ancient works than would be conveyed through the medium of drawings or prints, as Soane put it. Later in the same century, the trustees of the newly established Metropolitan Museum of Arts in New York proposed a bold transatlantic inversion of the Grand Tour itinerary when setting up a collection of architectural casts aiming at outdoing most European museums. In its plaster perfection, the collection at the Met would have European scholars come to New York as they now go to Rome, Athens, or the other great centers of the study of arts, as the curator, later the museum's director, Edward Robinson, explained in 1891. Andrew Carnegie promoted a democratization of taste when he, a decade later, decided to give his home city a world-leading collection of monuments. If they cannot go to the objects abroad, we shall do the best to bring the rarest of those objects to them at home, the industrialist pledged, assuring his fellow Pittsburghers that they could safely pursue their everyday lives while enjoying some of the pleasures and benefits of traveling abroad. Yet, of course, 19th century plaster casts did way more than presenting three-dimensional reproductions to those who could not experience the monuments firsthand in situ. They were often acts of preservation quite similar to some of Factum's productions today. And I prefer the word production for reproduction for the 19th century monuments I've been studying, as well as for contemporary high-end facsimiles. They often become monuments in their own right, with their own origins, biographies, trajectories. Let me provide one example briefly. The awe-inspiring, hyper-styled, full-scale reconstruction of two columns from the ruined Castor and Pollux temple from the Roman Forum, an obligatory destination for any grand tourist, that was erected in the glass-covered courtyard at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the 1870s. It was the work of 3 Prix de Rome recipients and world's leading molders, and it aimed at showing the perfection of antiquity, not the passing of time. One of its architects presented a little ode to the off-site experience of monuments for the inauguration of the pristine Parisian edition of the Roman monument. While the marble ruin in Rome would soon be scattered, he said, exposed to impious travelers' small hammers, we have fully recovered these columns, and one will have to go to Paris to study one of the most beautiful monuments of the Corinthian order. So to conclude, museums have always been about distancing things from their sources. The distance performed by such moving monuments and the way they speak about presence and absence, the way we can experience them as a vibrant and very real presence, somehow feels a bit comforting at the moment when the world appears both absent and distant. Zoom and the disembodied flatness of the screen doesn't exactly compensate for that.
Very good. Andres is speaking from Long Island. You need to
unmute.
Unmute.
There we go, the travails of technology right there. Yeah, so I don't think it's lost on any of us that we've just spent 2 months engaging with museums online. That is to say, we've been looking at copies. And so I think we're all engaged in a massive experiment in what it means to, what it's like to experience art in this way. So it's a big referendum on all that, and certainly a big pivot point as well. Many of you have mentioned the Met. I've spent a lot of time in the Met, both working and as a visitor. And as you know, it's the 150th anniversary of the Met. And they've been circulating wonderful images of the Great Hall filled with plaster casts. I've seen some of the remaining ones in the basement of the Met. Many of them have now been passed on to other institutions. But it was also in the Met that I was once, speaking of overhearing conversations in museums, I heard a wonderful overheard snippet of conversations in that extraordinary 2017 Michelangelo exhibition, which I suspect many of you visited in person. As you know, there was a quarter scale reproduction of the Sistine Chapel in the middle of that exhibition. And one day when I visited, I overheard 2 people speaking, and one of them said to the other, looking up at the ceiling, they said, "Can you believe it? They got the Sistine Chapel." So they were under the impression that the Met was able to borrow the whole thing. So authenticity to some extent is in the eye of the beholder. And seems to me that all of your comments so far, and to some extent this whole discussion, boils down to two propositions. One is that the question of original and copy is not binary. It's slippery. It's a kind of a continuum. These are not hard boundaries. These are negotiated boundaries. The second is that the question is not whether we can replicate an original perfectly, because indeed, already in the 19th century, extraordinary things happened, as has been mentioned, and now we have the ability to do it. That's not the issue. The issue is whether what results is an occasion for aesthetic experience, whether it's a work of art. And a place where you can contemplate these things is an incredible museum in Buenos Aires. I don't know if any of you had this experience of visiting the Carcova Museum in Buenos Aires, which is installed in a series of horse stables next to the great port. It used to be where the horses of the port of Buenos Aires came. And it is a museum entirely devoted to copies, plastic copies, originated by an artist of the same name and later growing into a collection of 700 objects, connected to the School of Art, so it had a didactic purpose. But what's really interesting, it's really a beautiful atmospheric museum. And to some extent, it recaptures the experience of what it must have been like to enter the Great Hall of the Met in 1874. But what's really interesting is that it's also a contemporary art museum. So alongside the copies of, great, first copies of works from the Louvre and the British Museum and the Berlin museums, there are contemporary artists. And these artists are often artists who like to play with the idea of original and fake, or they actually engage with these works. And it's the only museum I know today which really treats the original and the copy at an equal level. Very quickly, I just want to say, also related to this, that I think this question of when is it just an original and when is it art is a topic that in fact is very much alive and well in contemporary art. Many artists make this question the subject of their artistic practice. So if you think of an artist like Sherry Levine, whose works consist on exact copies of other artists' works, those are, of course, not fakes or replicas. They are new original works that consist of one artist's incorporation of the other artist's work into her own, thereby producing a conceptual artwork about this whole philosophical question of what is an ordinary thing, what is a copy, what is an original, what is a fake. Lastly, and I'll close here, I just want to say on a personal note, it just so happens, speaking of philosophy, that the house that I'm speaking from previously belonged to the late great critic and philosopher Arthur Danto, who perhaps more than most dedicated his life to the question of what distinguishes an ordinary thing from a work of art, something that we can get into later. But it was in the garden that I'm looking out at now that he wrote a book called The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. And I think those words echo very well in this conversation. So the question of how an object, whether it's a copy or an original, is endowed with the cultural significance of being an aesthetic object is a very complex philosophical question in the end. And I think today's conversation is really an exploration of that in so many ways.
Neil.
Thank you.
Somewhere in London.
Somewhere in London. I'd like to go back to where Marina began us. The idea that the aura, the significance of an object can be created, increased by being copied, and is created by people in the looking, in the copying. And I want to start with Michelangelo's David, which you all know. If you'd been in Florence on the 12th of November 2010, you were able to see 4 full-size replicas of Michelangelo's David. The original in the Accademia, the copy in the Piazza della Signoria outside the Palazzo Vecchio, the copy on the Piazzale Michelangelo up on the hill looking over the city, and a fiberglass copy placed where the original was meant to be, on the top of the cathedral. And I think that tells you everything about the meaning and the aura of a great object. Because I think aura is perhaps not the right word. What we're really talking about is the role these objects can play in our lives. And over time, objects take on different roles. We want them to fulfill different roles. And the Michelangelo began originally, the David was meant to be David, the champion of the chosen people against evil, going to stand on the cathedral. It was quite clear once it was made that it was never going to be possible to lift it. And it had come to mean something else. It had come to mean, of course, the resistance of Republican Florence against tyranny. And so it had to be somewhere else. And that's where it stood, and it was attacked as a political statement in the 1520s. By the 1870s, what was clear was that people were really interested in Michelangelo, and it was taken into academia, no longer meaning either the symbol of David as the champion of the chosen people, no longer Republican Florence, but as Michelangelo, the genius of Michelangelo. By the 1860s, Florence had become the capital of a new Italy. The symbol of that new Italy, or the Risorgimento, the new young country, was going to be David. And so another one needed to be made for the Piazzale Michelangelo. And that, I think, is extraordinarily revealing. This object has come to mean different things at different times. All those meanings coexist, but for them to be achieved, for those roles to be played out, we need reproductions. We need them if an object is going to become all the different things it can be, if a great work of art is to fulfill itself. And to finish, Mark talked about the cast courts at the V&A. There is, of course, the full-scale reproduction of Michelangelo's David. And that's, again, a different role. There, Michelangelo, that statue, as part of the great family of the European artistic creation, of the great communal effort of European art. And I want to end by disagreeing with Anna rather violently about the idea of a museum as an orphanage. An orphanage it's not. It's where great works of art eventually find the people they've always wanted to be with. Titian was adored by Rubens, by Velasquez. They would love to be there beside him, I think, in a museum. And that's what you find in the cast court in the V&A. Michelangelo with the company that he deserves and with the company that allows him to fulfill a different role for a great work of art.
Okay, so we're now going to have a bit of general discussion with the speakers. I haven't worked out quite how it's going to work. Maybe because he's spoken most recently, I'll start with Neil, because Neil, with the 4 versions of David, the one that tourists still want to see and queue to see is the one in the Accademia. The one in the Piazza della Signoria is there in order to give a sense of its urban location. But you're not suggesting they have equivalent value. It's just that the copy does have a legitimacy.
I am suggesting they have equivalent value in the roles which we've imposed on them.
Yeah, I guess do. Marina is going to. Yes, Marina.
As Marina said, and as Mark said, we have come to attach a particular importance to the role of the original creative work that by the great individual artist. But that's our preference. All the others have their own value, and they can fulfill that role only because there are several of them and the different roles in the different places.
I mean, I think this sort of historical point, this point about history is changing the story of a work of art, relates very much to a question of our time, and that's to do with the debate today about the role of museums. because I think that the story at the moment, the most emphatic story, broad brush, is about the greatness of individual artists. This is the sort of Western story. And actually what we begin to need in our interconnected and possibly socially distanced world are more collective stories, which are generated more from the museum visitors than actually from the historical circumstances of the individual genius. And I think we see that in a lot of museum activities now. So in one sense, the originality, authenticity argument is actually a kind of narrative. And it's connected, to my mind, very strongly with the values of the art market. And if we want to get away from that sort of rather horrendous excess of value accrued to single works of art, we need to reposition the narratives that museums are telling. I mean, I'm not a museum person, so I don't know how to do it, but I have actually seen a lot of activities of that kind in which there is an invitation to children to respond, to tell stories, to think about the works of art in very different ways from this narrative of exceptional people creating exceptional objects.
I'm going to turn to Andres because, as I said at the beginning, he did this article in which he talked about how museums might in some way be configured slightly differently post-COVID-19, just because that community aspect, which Marina has alluded to, of the idea of it being somewhere where people can congregate and talk about things they hold in common, may become more significant than the aura of the individual object, if I've interpreted you correctly, Andres.
Well, yes, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that that obviates, or in any way, it's not a
it's not a replacement. It's an addition.
It's both. I mean, I do think that we're having this conversation at a very particular moment when I think we may fall into the trap of extrapolating too far out of this experience of the last 2 months. I think what is for certain is, in fact, one thing we can say for sure about this moment is that it actually it will turn out to have been a pivot point in terms of how widely people are connecting digitally to institutions. I don't know the metrics, but I know that many museums, which previously had this kind of content available, are seeing 1,000% increase. And that in turn, I think, will trigger what has happened in our digital culture in general, that the more people see these things from a distance, the more they develop a fascination with one day coming to see them in person. So actually, I'm very optimistic that in this explosion of mediated museum engagement, we will have even more interest in seeing the actual objects when we can get around to it. Will we have to create new protocols around it? Perhaps. Mind you, the last exhibition I saw in New York before everything closed down was the extraordinary Donald Judd exhibition at MoMA. And thankfully, maybe because of the precautions, I'm not sure, but they were already limiting the number of people in the galleries. And I can tell you it was a great experience. And finally, a museum director friend of mine who I can't name, who has a museum that doesn't have a lot of attendance, was joking the other day saying, well, maybe our next marketing campaign can be, haven't you always dreamed of being alone in a museum with the objects? Now you can do that. So,
Mary next.
Well,
Mary, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, that's a dream many people share, and that scholars are very happy to, lucky to get visit museums on Mondays. But of course, very many museums in the world are not crowded, and the most exhibitions are not the blockbuster exhibition, and very few artworks are traumatized by its celebrity status in the way the Mona Lisa is, for instance. So of course, the whole world, in the country, in the city, local, regional museums are there. And I think that when the museums now, having exposed us for this kind of themselves as libraries, watching images of collections for 2 months soon, And of course, all these 360 degrees tours that are a bit tiresome, but of course we can get to see things that we wouldn't get to see anyway. But as soon as people are transitioned back, of course, the exclusive experience of being in uncrowded museums is something that could be encouraged very much by the museum institution. And that reminds me about the heads of the Norwegian Preservation Authority, great art historian, who unsuccessfully proposed in the 1920s that the National Gallery in Oslo should be open until midnight every day, so that the working class could visit the museum after work, and others, of course, and that also one should be served fat milk and dark beer, so that it should be something soothing both for the mind and the body. And I think that kind of initiatives is something that, so the museums should rather open up more when Corona blows off and take this opportunity to think through how they work. And I couldn't agree more. Being alone or with a friend or with a foreigner in a museum with the object is such an incredibly exclusive and lovely experience that we should cherish and plan for, if possible.
I think Henry Cole was very keen on evening opening and refreshments and making it possible. And oddly enough, people always think of Kenneth Clark as having been a great elitist, but actually when he was National Gallery in the 1930s, he did a lot to let people in on Saturday afternoons so the football crowds could come in. Mark, actually I want to ask Mark about his thing about the Impressionists, because it sounded very good, but the chronology doesn't really work, because it took such a long time. I mean, the legitimacy and currency of reproductions was maintained probably till the First World War. Friedlander's connoisseurship is only in the 30s. You need to press the button. Press the button. Unmute.
No, the chronology works really well, Charles. Actually, the first textual evidence for despising copies comes in the 1870s. Pretty much immediately after the first Impressionist exhibition. But of course, as with the reception of Impressionism itself, it took quite a long time, a long generation for it to work its way through. I did want to just make a point, which is we talk as though museums were built to contain masterpieces. This is, of course, as Neil, among others, will confirm, not true at all. Most things in museums were never intended to be masterpieces of art. What they are is evidence of the cultures of the past, of the attitudes and the beliefs enshrined in their material culture. And of course, copies, however brilliant they are, don't have that evidential dimension to them. Equally, when people go to museums, a lot of what they're seeking is that sense of connection, of direct connection to things that were made by other people at other times in other places. And copies can't fulfill that need. What I think that copies can do, and what I think is brilliant, is that they can recreate the experience that was intended by the original makers of these things. And that's what we're missing most of the time. What museums have to do is to put objects in low light levels, in glass cases, and that, of course, deprives you of a real direct experience of the objects in the way that was originally intended. And if I were promoting copies, it's that experience which I think is, a brilliant added dimension coming out of them.
Adam, who's not meant to be speaking, wants to speak. So, Adam, you're allowed to, from Madrid. But
Unmute.
you've got to press the button in order for us to hear you.
Sorry.
Unmute yourself.
I've unmuted, sorry. No, I'd love to pick up on what Mark's just said. I mean, obviously, a facsimile, a copy, doesn't have the same material composition or doesn't consist of the same material evidence. I would in a way turn the image round. So very often what we talk about in all the projects and all the work Factum Foundation's carrying out is that really we're recording something in order to find different ways to reveal its material evidence. And so while the actual facsimile doesn't contain it, the digital data very often does. So if I could use an example which really picks up, I think, on what you were alluding to. would be the work we've done recently with the Victoria and Albert Museum to record the cartoons by Raphael. So again, linking back to Marina's comment, I think Raphael is perhaps the artist who has so much to offer. So it's in a way very sad that it's the 500th anniversary of his death. The amazing show at the Scuderia di Quirinale opened on the 3rd of March and was really closed down pretty much straight away. Hopefully it'll reopen very soon. But there we were able to make an exact facsimile of one of the cartoons and show it at eye level without glass next to one of the tapestries that was made from it, or perhaps made from it. And I think this sense of representing things that often can't be seen, the Mona Lisa was mentioned earlier, and she really is almost hidden away behind the bulletproof glass, behind the barriers, behind the crowds, mainly looking at the Veronese to take selfies with the Mona Lisa in the background. So I think that's where the high resolution recordings provide the data for people to study, to reveal the material evidence that makes something specifically what it is and makes it so important within a museum.
I mean, it's interesting to me that the Raphael cartoons are an example of an extraordinarily important work of art which has never really acquired an aura. There's something about the way it's displayed and the scale of the court, which means that anyway, visitors, if you go there, they're very seldom people really looking at them or studying them. It's maybe because, as you suggested, they're behind thick glass and hung rather high. Mark is going to speak, and then I want to ask Mary to talk about Proust. Mark, you had your hand up, I think.
Yes, I did. Sorry, I agree entirely. I think it would be great for the Raphael cartoons to be seen in. It's ever the case that a copy is exempt from the attitudes of the period in which it's made. And I think one of the most interesting things about copies is that they always tell you something about the way in which those who made them saw the world.
Okay, I'm going to get Mary to talk about Proust, because I think it's a very good example of attitudes to the real and the copy. And then we're going to get Lizzie online to start asking questions from the audience. So Mary, over to you and Proust.
Okay. Well, there is center stage in Proust's novel In Search of Lost Time, which is, as you all know, furnished with real artworks and real artists, resides a plastered portal, and it very much makes the core, surprisingly a little bit perhaps, of Proust's museum philosophy. So this, just to retell a little story, is that the young hero of the book, let's call him Marcel, has been visiting as a child repeatedly the Musée de Sculpture Comparée in Paris, the Trocadero Museum is it's called, so it's obvious that place. And then he desperately falls in love with a fictitious cast of a fictitious church in a fictitious town, namely Balbec on the Norman shore. And then longs desperately to see the real thing. So finally he gets to go with his grandmother, famously, on summer vacation and gets to see the real thing, and is tremendously disappointed by the experience of the real thing. And Proust says something very sensational when describing the plaster perfection in Paris, where this portal is then perfectly mounted, perfectly lit. You can get close up, you can see it fits, it works so it's such a nice parallel to much of Adam's work, of course. And then getting it out into reality with all the disturbances and all the trivial things that the world is full of, the banal surroundings. And then Proust says when Marcel is exposed to the real thing, that it is nothing but its own shape in stone, which is a very kind of fantastic way of describing something that is in stone and not plaster. And also he says that the original is caught in la tyrannie du particulier, so the tyranny of the particular is something that threatens the original thing. It's of course corrupted by the work of time. It appears lifeless, and it appears accidental. So I think that is kind of an emblematic little scene from a big novel that has a lot to do with what we're discussing. And I think that also the way in which Proust so effortlessly inverts conventional hierarchies of copies and original could also help us to think differently about issues such as material authenticity, for instance, things that are addressed in this enormous book. And personally, I felt a little bit like the young Marcel when I saw the Venetian Veronese in Venice in 2009. Suddenly seeing the real thing, which is then of course not the real thing, but then in its very real setting, flooded by the light and the reflection from the laguna and on the right height and all of that. So it was kind of a Proust moment.
Actually, interestingly, I read this afternoon that the abbot or whoever it is at St. George of Nigeria said that if he was offered the original back, he wouldn't want it because it would mean they couldn't eat, and it would impose all sorts of conditions in terms of the way the work of art was viewed, so that actually he much preferred having the copy. Yeah. Let's go over to Lizzie for some questions from the audience.
Charles, can I do one thing before Lizzie? In our title, while we've got everyone here, the part of the title is about the future of what happens to museums after COVID-19, what happens when we return, what might happen. And I think it would be wonderful if Neil or any of the other panelists could have a few thoughts about what might happen next.
Let's see, I would be surprised if there's a question from the audience which reflects that issue. Because, just to say, we're going to finish at between 6:20 and 6:30, more or less. And I'll get everybody to say something at the end. So it may be sensible to use that in summing up. So Lizzie, questions from the audience, assuming there are some.
Yes, we do have one question from the audience, which is in a way about, not so much about what's happening after COVID, but what's happening at the moment. And asking whether any so from someone called Zeynep Özcan, and saying, have any members of the panel tried to or had profound visual interaction with art or cultural heritage online over the course of the COVID period?
Okay,
talk about that.
Marina is putting her finger up. Yeah, Marina, press the button.
Yes, I watched online. I was very impressed by it. The virtual tour of Linda. She's an artist who began as a feminist activist and does photography collages. I think she will become very much better known. This is her first major show at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge. And it was an absolute model, but it does show that if you work in photography, you have an added advantage to being reproduced digitally. There is less, I don't know, how that technically works, but clearly, if you look at the Van Eyck tour, which I also did because I missed that show as well, there the scale matters much more, and the very intensive close-ups draw terrific attention to the craquelure. You don't see a whole image, you see the kind of disintegration, the hand of time. That may be very interesting, but it isn't quite the experience that I had many, many years ago when I saw the Van Eyck in Ghent. So I think that the medium, the original medium that is being reproduced in the virtual tour matters tremendously to the quality of the tour. Secondly, the compare matters. Amy Tubin, the curator of the Linda show at Kettle's Yard, excellent.
Neil, it looked as if you, or maybe you were just stroking your nose.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the very pleasing things about having to, being able only to look at paintings from the National Gallery or other galleries and what's visit online, is that you can arrange with friends to go and look at one painting. And the great difficulty we all have in a great collection is there's too much to look at. And I've several times now with a number of friends online, we've all looked at the same painting in a public collection, which is one painting. And of course, with Zoom, you can see it far better than you ever can in the gallery in detail. And I think it's certainly reminded me that the value of being able to focus with friends on one picture and creating a social engagement through the picture, with no distractions. That's something that can certainly survive, but it's an enormous gain, I think, so that I wouldn't have done this otherwise, and is open to everybody where the gallery or the museum makes the pictures of high quality available free online.
Well, of course, we may go back to the Second World War regime where you're only allowed to view a work of art on your own without lots of people taking selfies, so that in a sort of way, that experience will be translated to 3 dimensions. Andres, what's been your COVID experience?
Well, this may also hint a little bit about this future thing. I want to say that I think, you know, seeing a work online, a single object will, of course, not be a perfect experience, though it may lend itself to the kind of interaction that Neil is talking about. But actually, I think when people engage with art online, it's not so much that they go to see individual objects, but they go to see exhibitions and they go inside institutions. This morning, I went for a tour of the just released, just opened virtual reality version of Hauser and Wirth's gallery's new Menorca location. Yesterday, they created a virtual reality version. And, you know, you navigate through the whole experience. And I would guess that the vast majority of this kind of online engagement is not so much focused on individual objects, but on sort of traversing exhibitions. And in the future, that will be even more the case. I found that to be an interesting thing to do. But regarding the future, I will say this: it made me think that as we re-examine our methodologies of curation and exhibition, installation, and design in the future, we will be taking into account what it means to navigate an exhibition in this way. Because, you know, it's sort of that Google Street View style. There's a dot and then the camera sort of moves there. But it also opens up wonderful new didactic opportunities because there are layers and layers of additional content, which then immediately hide behind the works. So one of my prognoses, among many hopefully today, is that we will, I think, very quickly see that possibility being incorporated into how exhibitions are conceived.
Mark and Mary, do you have any particular COVID experiences you want to share? No, we'll go on to the next question. Lizzie.
Yes, so a question from Kate Colleran about facsimiles, and she's asking about the, she says that the painting of, for example, the marriage at Cana will have aged a certain ages over time. And she asks how long the facsimile will remain true to the original. And also, what do we know about the ways that facsimiles change over time? How do they age?
I think I'm going to ask Adam to answer that because it's to do with the way the facsimile is created. Mary may also, but we'll start with Adam on the...
I'll do it very fast. I mean, obviously the original Wedding at Cana has aged in dramatic ways. So it aged naturally, if you like, up until the point it was ripped off the wall. Then it went through a series of restorations that changed it quite dramatically while it was in the Louvre. The most recent was in the 1989 to 1991, when it was cleaned and it fell off and it got damaged and it got revarnished with an optically clear varnish, which really changes the color harmonies. But also one of the major figures changed dramatically because it was cleaned back. The orange was removed, well actually it was brown because it had aged, but the brown orange was taken off and it's green underneath. What I can say about the facsimile is we were obviously incredibly worried because Venice is one of the most hostile environments for any painting, especially, as Charles hinted, in a room that has no climate control, that is bright daylight, is open to the elements. So part of the beauty is the room is still alive, it's still used. People go there, they eat there, there are conferences, it's a living space. After a decade, so we put it there in 2007, it is completely unchanged as of today. it probably needs a little clean. It's got some dust and some spider's webs, I noticed last time I was there. But more or less, I believe that facsimile, because as far as possible, we use pigments, we used we wove the same canvas that Veronese was using, we used the same grounds. I believe, in all probability, in 100 years' time, it will not be significantly different. One of the things about
Okay, Adam, you've had it. It's Mary's turn. Mary has had something to say, I think. Switch on.
Forgive me.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good question. And before trying to add something to Adam's answer, I would like to ask Adam, would you consider replacing Veronese, for instance, in Venice, in case, would the historicity of the facsimile mean a lot to you? That it's 50 years and it has faded? Would that be an interesting part with the patina? Because that's also part of the aura, of course. Well, while you think about that, I can try to answer the very good question, because I've been interested, and also I've been following a little bit Factum scanning of the Egyptian tombs in Egypt. And it's something very peculiar with the fact that these two tombs, Seti and Tutankhamun, has been completely, meticulously, painstakingly recorded at a very random moment in time. So it's like 3,200 years and blah, 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 many days. And of course, at some point, the Tutankhamun facsimile will start deteriorating of different reasons, and maybe things that you cannot even imagine. That will, because it's a different material, etc. So of course, the original will develop in a time of its own, and so will the facsimile, and they will depart, but still they're part of the same trajectory and the same biography. So it's something very interesting with, it's not one thing following the others, they will have parallel times, which will then, as you keep furnishing now the globe with new facsimiles of existing monuments, you know, it will be interesting for the archaeologists sometimes in the future.
Very interestingly, Factum did an exhibition at the Royal Academy about 4 years ago, and they showed 4 versions of a bust of a lawyer whose wife wanted to have a commissioned bust for his 60th birthday. And it had been made in 4 different materials. One was bronze, one was glass, one was chocolate. Much the best was the one made out of chocolate, which is an incredibly beautiful material. But already by the time it was exhibited, somebody had eaten the ear. So I couldn't figure out whether it was the fragility of the material which made it beautiful. Marina, I think you had something to say.
I was just enjoying that very much. Actually, I mean, I think it's interesting that that was a commission, because one of the things I think we've been slightly sort of underemphasizing is the, perhaps not in the case of Proust, but is the affective, the emotional relationship that people develop. And I think it sometimes overcomes the lack of evidence or the lack of authenticity, the attachment. And I would like to, the attachment people develop to works of art. And I think that, for example, very small models become very collectible, and indeed souvenirs. I mean, almost everybody comes back from a trip to Rome or with some redaction of the original which has captured their fancy. It could be just a postcard. But I think it actually matters very much that we don't want it to be exactly the same. We're very happy with it being smaller or lesser. There's still a possibility of that deep connection that Mark was talking about to the materiality and the history of the makers and the context. But it can survive in a trace as light as a postcard.
Okay, we should go on to the next question, Lizzie.
So we've got a question from Sophie Tyrrell, who is asking about, I think the concentration our new concentration on masterpieces, which comes when you are reproducing paintings digitally and through facsimiles. And she says that in increasing the greatness of these particular works, you bolster their cultural and financial value, which can be to the detriment of other work. And what does the panel think about that?
Okay, so it reinforces, Marina, I think you can start on that.
No, I've already talked.
Okay. Who wants to talk about the way digital reproduction? I mean, in a way, the Veronese is a good example, because the Veronese in the Louvre is, as Adam, I think, said, it's in the same room as the Mona Lisa, so nobody pays any attention to it whatsoever. So the replication gives it a standing, which in a curious way, the original somehow lacks because of the way it's placed. Andres, you were about to say something. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a bit of a, I don't want to say it's a red herring, but I think that the idea that the extreme value placed on one object sort of devalues the other is, I'm not sure if it really holds up. And you know, one of the thoughts I've been having looking at the Foundation's work is that we may be looking, and in technology in general, we may be looking ahead to a new golden age of reproduced three-dimensional art. I mean, we have several hundred years of history in which masterpieces were reproduced in 2 dimensions, and that has helped popularize those works tremendously. And all of the museums are full of wonderful etchings and reproduced reproductive media that have popularized and created a worldwide interest in the work of artists, which has continued unabated. But I think what's interesting now is that we have the technologies to have a similar possibility of large-scale reproductions of sculpture and three-dimensional objects, so that you may buy an inexpensive sculpture for your home the way people have for a long time purchased less expensive etchings and so on. Generally, I feel that ever since the arrival of the video cassette machine, where everybody thought, well, that's going to kill the movies, there's been an anxiety about technologies that are reproducing technologies. They're always feared to destroy the greatly cherished originals. But in fact, the historical record shows over and over again that whenever we have deployed large-scale reproductive capabilities, it has only elevated the prestige and the interest and the popularity. And this has been true in food, it's been true in fashion, and it's true in art.
I'm going to just promote one aspect of what Factum does, which is through the Foundation, they record and document works of art which are inaccessible to all of us. So that one of their projects is to record things called, they've got a more proper name, but I know them as Cross River monoliths, which, because they're in the Cross River territory in Nigeria. Now, I'm never ever going to go to Nigeria, almost certainly. That they're quite hard to get to, but they're historically very important. And subject to coronavirus, there was going to be an exhibition in the British Museum in November, at which point it would be impossible to see them. So far from just reinforcing the status of existing canon of works of art, I think what reproduction gives one the opportunity of doing is learning about global culture in a way that I think the 19th century explorers understood. Yeah, Marina.
Yes, well, you've reminded me that Adam Lowe and the Factum actually reconstructed an entirely lost object of antiquity for the exhibition about maps at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, when the beautiful silver disc of Al-Aldrisi's world map from 12th century Sicily was the centerpiece of the show. This is known only from an Ottoman map, is that right? And I think, I mean, so it was reconstructed. Well, you described what you did. The point was that it brought back into existence a work that was entirely we haven't got it. So it isn't just a question of saving; it's also a question of generating from existing descriptions and images. and in some ways, you know, antiquity was also copied. The Romans, of course, copied the Greeks when the objects were lost and so forth. I mean, this is a strong tradition in the history of art, of actually retrieving the lost objects through imaginary reconstructions.
I'm watching the clock. We've got time for one more question and answers. And then at the end, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question which I was asked to ask, which is, which work of art would they most like reproduced? So I'm giving them time to think of the answer to that question while Lizzie asks her final question from the audience.
I've got a question from John Heslop, who asks, how are modern facsimiles different from 19th century casts, not just in what they're able to reproduce, but also in the ways that they're used and function within society?
I'm going to ask Mark to answer that because he knows all about electrotyping in a way that I don't. Mark, are you there?
Like a robot.
Mark,
I'm not sure whether I can really answer that question. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think I'm going to get married to answer it because your Samsung, wonderful as it is, seems to have gone a bit offline. So we're going to get married to answer the question about the differences between 19th century technologies and contemporary, how far they're superior. And I had understood from a conversation with Mark that his view was that actually they were in some ways superior, although there was potentially damage to the objects because it involved intervention with the objects. Mary.
I might not be the right person to ask because I will give the very boring answer that the difference isn't that big. So to me, it's not a big difference between a copper plate and a mold and the scanning apparatus to make a digitally produced facsimile, because the result is as physical, as tangible, as material, as concrete. So for instance, these brilliant 19th century formatori, Burciani was mentioned, and there are a number of them. You know, they were so extremely skilled in what they were doing, and of course, the wizards at Factum know exactly what they're doing. And I think it's a kind of like to me, it's very much a kind of continuation of the same urge to understand monuments and artworks, the surfaces, the context, the movements, the replacements. So I think to me, it's very much the same. Although I think it's more interesting to talk about a high quality facsimile and you know, a 3D print. You know, some people think it's the same, you can just print the thing and there it is. Of course, Factum artist's work is full of hand, you know, brilliant artists making the surfaces in the end. So that might not be the most exciting answer to that question, but I think it's looking through the last couple of 100 years. To me, it's a similarity in this, and I think the passion for understanding artworks through copying them, in the best sense of the word copying, it's really very much, to me, a definition of tradition in the most profound hermeneutical way.
Okay, Adam, in what way is what you do superior to what they did in the...
It's not superior or not, we just never touch. So you hinted at it before. Contact recording is something that's not possible now and caused a lot of damage. What I would say is that, in partly an answer to Mary's previous question that I didn't answer, was that you know, what we're doing is really a time slice. We record an object at a particular moment, and that data is vital to monitor its condition, to monitor change, to feed into the community of conservators and restorers and people, non-contact preservationists, who are actually working to ensure those objects last. Because the more people who want to see them, as anyone who works in the National Trust or elsewhere knows, the more the public demand, the more the strain on the object themselves. And so really the main part of our job, while we do make facsimiles, and while facsimiles I think are incredibly important in the narrative and in communicating, really it's about providing data to work with experts. If I picked up on Marina's example of the Aladrisi map, really what Factum does is provide extraordinarily skilled technicians and people to work with experts. So in the case of the Al-Idrisi map, we mainly worked with Jerry Broughton and a number of other map specialists like Daniel Crouch to really re-understand what that map was, what it was doing. We worked with indirectly Yossi Rappaport, who's spent years studying the map, and we worked with the team in Cairo who were translating all the toponyms. So really what we're doing is providing data to enhance academic knowledge, to enhance aesthetic knowledge.
Okay, so we're going to end. Andres, what would you most like reproduced?
Okay, well, I'd give you the short answer and then just a little extra on top. You know, I was looking out in my garden. I would love to have my own little Brancusi out there. It would look great. But the longer answer is I would like all works to be reproduced. And this is really, earlier you asked me about the democratization of museums. I think that there are many, many reasons why we would want a lot of artworks to be reproduced at low cost and made available so that they can be present in educational settings in all around the world so that people could engage with them the way they had always engaged with copies, knowing they were copies, but for educational reasons, but also a host of other reasons. Think of the fact that many of our visitors are blind. They would love to touch objects. What if they could touch every work of art? There are a million reasons why we want to do this on a wide scale, make it easy so that people can, you know, enjoy art. And then every now and then, if they love a work so much, they can go and see the original in a museum.
Neil.
Yes, I think I would like to see pictures not actually reproduced, but to go back to the question asked about true to the original. One of the things that new techniques can do is actually recover what the artist painted in terms of the colors. We all know that the pictures now are pictures after several hundred years. Colors have changed, the balance between the two has changed. And the great picture in the National Gallery, Veronese, of the family of Darius, that's a wonderful, I think one of the greatest pictures in European painting. But we can't really see it as Veronese left it, as he wanted us to see it, because the sky has gone gray. Not that anybody's changed it, but the colors have faded. Through scientific analysis, we know what is there. We know what the colors are. We could recover completely the balance, the image, the brilliance that the artist wanted us to see. And I think this technology could give us, for the first time, the experience that the artists intended us to have, not just replicating what the state of the objects now is after time has diminished them. So that's what I would like to see, the family of Darius as it left Veronese's studio.
Mary? Switch yourself on, Mary.
I was unmuted. Well, if it's for me personally and not for the world, for a museum, I could rather show my favorite reproduction because it sits there just beside of me. See up in the corner here. This is, as many of you would recognize immediately, Ashurnasirpal II hunting a lion from his chariot. The original is in Berlin, of course, at the Pergamon Museum, but the interesting thing for me is that this very cast is made from the original, or the mold that was taken from the original in the 19th century before that practice was banned. And some of these molds still are in a workshop north of Boston, and I came over the guy who owns them, a living formatore, and he produced this for me. So that's a very nice reproduction, which I love a lot.
Mark?
Oh, I'd like the Parthenon, please.
In your garden, in Cumberland. We can all come and visit the Parthenon in Cumberland.
No,
Okay.
I like it on the Acropolis, actually. I think it would be more fun to have it there. And I think what's so interesting about copies is that every copy tells you something about the copyist. They always think that it doesn't, but it does. And when the Parthenon is reproduced on the Acropolis, people will reel back in horror at the appalling taste of the ancient Greeks. And
And we all realize that the Parthenon marbles are the creation of generation after generation of projection.
There is a Parthenon in Nashville, isn't there?
There is.
Nashville, Tennessee.
Made of concrete.
I think it's not painted, but it's not painted.
Made of
Marina, you've got the last word. What do you want?
Well, I thought I was being ambitious, but I realize now it's very, very small. I just want the Cappella Palatina from Palermo, with all of it, the mosaics, the Arabic roof, the floor, the whole thing.
Very good. Well, on that note, can I please thank the panel very much indeed? Can I thank Adam and Anna for organizing this event? And at this point, the one bit I haven't thought about is there ought to be huge applause from the people who are watching. But of course, there's no equivalent to online applause. So in this fact only, online is very diminished. So thank you all very much indeed. And I certainly look forward to watching the equivalent event tomorrow. Thank you.
Tap each other.
Exactly. Thank you.
We can be switched off.
Are we switched